In addition to the values I listed at the beginning of this video, I want to outline 3 personal goals that I have with this project. And I invite you to share in them if they feel like a fit. The first is to create a playbook for sexual abuse and trauma survivors. And to understand this goal and why I think it's important, a couple of data points may be useful. The average sexual abuse survivor in America takes 11 years to come forward. That's 11 years in shame, fear, uncertainty, secrecy, silence, etc. And in that time, it is normal. It's very common, in fact, for whatever abuse pattern is kind of veiled in secrecy to continue. In just the law of momentum, generally a force carries forward until a force equal or greater interrupts it. And there are very strong reasons for abuse. In order to abuse someone, typically there needs to be a blind spot, often a buried abuse pattern inside the abuser. It's our nature to be viral, meaning whatever we're doing inside our psyche, in our relationship with ourselves, we're moving towards doing to others. Now, we do have a very interesting buffer that we've created culturally, which is both tragic and also in some other ways practical, which says that when we are with an acquaintance or in polite society, we don't follow the integrity of our relationship with ourselves. We follow a set of cult scripted rules. I should say hello, I should say please, I should say thank you, I should say what a good job in this situation to this type of person. And we listen to this culturally scripted voice in our head. And meanwhile, we do not say this to ourselves. We don't say, please, could we do this? We say, get a move on, stop being so lazy. We don't say thank you for getting out of bed to ourselves, or how lovely to see you today, Dane. Because what are we doing with life? And so there's this gap in between the polite, scripted cult kind of interaction and the relationship that we have with ourselves. As we move into more intimate relationships, and particularly as we move into this phenomena of marriage, where two people become as one, all this cult scripting just flies out the window. And we treat other people exactly the way we treat ourselves. And we treat ourselves exactly the way we treat other people. To be married to someone is in many ways to understand how they treat themselves. What's their inner dialogue like? And the closer we get to someone, the more we interact with the reality, with the status quo of that inner dialogue. And in some ways, I think, this ties into the, importance of the professional container. For example, with a therapist, because, any number of therapists are a complete mess in their personal lives, but can still do great work when this distance protocol, in other words, when they're following the script in their head of this is what a great loving therapist would do, it's not how I treat myself, they can do quite well, just as, it's an interesting phenomena in our cult that, I would say, a good percentage of business relationships go quite well. 95% of all my jobs get done early. They all get done on budget. 78% of my clients recommend me. I did an informal study. I return all calls, etc. And this is kind of a scripted thing. It's not that I necessarily feel like returning all those calls, etc. It's following a script that works. And yet in the personal sphere, there's all kinds of things that, it's like, I don't like the way that person sees me. I wish I didn't feel this way about this. And so, in these scripted terrains, things can work. So, in an abuse dynamic, there is, a deep connection between abusing oneself and being abused. In many ways, the cult in which we are born, the cult family, the cult culture, the patterns of how this part of me is treated. How is the feminine treated in men in this cult? How is the sensitive persona treated in this cult? How is the innocence of sexuality treated in this cult? Is it a protocol of violation? Is it a protocol of honoring? Is it a protocol of relating to the divine? How do we relate to the innocence and the femininity within this cult? What is done to our inner feminine personas in many ways is what we will do unless we interrupt this momentum, this brainwashing momentum to do to others what has been done to us. Because it feels good, there's a symmetry. Someone dumped a ton of bricks into my arms. Okay, I've got a ton of bricks to get rid of. Let me dump them into your arms. And it takes a lot more work to say, okay, someone gave me a ton of bricks, but I'm only going to give you one brick. And what am I going to do with these bricks? Someone gave me all this abuse and this. What am I going to do with it? In a cult that is psychologically and emotionally illiterate, meaning we don't teach people emotional literacy in school. We don't teach people empathy in school. We teach people to be sociopathic. That's typically the playbook for someone to survive high school in our cult. Just become sociopathic, care less, relate to the cool people, i.e. the sociopathic people, the people who don't care, and focus on the exterior, not the interior. It's a complete playbook for a sociopathic ethic. And the question is, what do we do? What does an abuse survivor do in this cult when they discover that they're left carrying the bag? And, particularly in a vertical relationship, where you have a therapist, a priest, the Catholic Church is estimated to have 5% of its priests be pedophiles. And they've, of course, created, as you'll see in Mea Culpa Maxima, an entire office. The Vatican dedicated an entire office to, first of all, quell and suppress and silence the victims of sexual abuse. If that didn't work, to buy off the parents with non-disclosures. And if that didn't work, they would move the pedophile out of that district, take him to a nice resort where the other pedophile priests interacted. And they kind of developed strategy. And then they would send the same priest back to a new community without telling the new community that their priest was a pedophile, and that the statistics around pedophilic sexual abuse would be that they would absolutely do what they did before, just with better results, meaning they would be more secret about it, manage the evidence more, because they had a second chance to learn how to sexually abuse children without getting caught, and they'd been networking with their fellow priests, better do this. And this is where the deaf boys in a boarding school, were one of the most vulnerable because it was more likely to believe a 6-year-old girl had been molested than a boy, so molest boys. People who are deaf are more isolated, so deaf is better than people who can communicate with everyone else. And people in boarding schools, more isolated, less cared for by their families. If you really love your child and want to get to know them, who sends a child off to boarding school? And so that's our target. And mea culpa maxima is made from that demographic. And when you've got a $1 billion organization who's committed to silencing a narrative that has shaped your life with shame, with confusion, with fear, it's a huge trauma in between you and relationship with God, Goddess, all that is, because whether you believe it's an angry God or whatever, it's like my fucking representative of divinity. Is the most hideous person I can imagine. How do I relate to a deity? How do I relate to the divine when my representation of the divine is someone so subhuman that they'll go out and do this in public, and then they'll do this behind closed doors, and they'll let me rot in psychological hell indefinitely because they're hypocrites, and this is incredibly difficult for one individual to deal with alone. The trouble is, how do you connect with others in a shame cult, in a cult of secrecy and silence, where as soon as you bring it up, in our cult, you tell someone in high school you were sexually abused, and suddenly you've got people teasing you, jeering at you, avoiding you, parents telling their kids not, because we are an abuse cult. Because that's what we do with ourselves. That's what we do when some part of us is in deep hurt and pain. We abuse that part. We silence it. We say, don't let anyone see that part. Don't hang out with me, abused part of me, while I'm trying to be cool. I want to be the one who has no pain, no abuse, etc. I want to be in a sociopathic state and pretend I'm above feelings, because the feelings are feminine, and we're chauvinistic. And so how does someone in all of that, tyranny of, systemic cultural abuse actually find their dignity again, come out from the burial ground of layer upon layer of denial, minimizing, anger, attack, isolation, etc., and say, there's nothing wrong with me. I was born into an abusive cult at a certain state in evolution. And this is what happens to a percentage of our people in that state and in that evolution. It's not my fault. It's not even necessarily terribly valuable to say that it is the abuser's fault, because that's part of the chauvinism. Yes, it's better in many ways for an older or a therapist or a parent who is abusing their child to take the hit if a hit needs to be taken, than the therapeutic patient who's paid money to be abused, than the 6-year-old child who can't stop a grown man from violating them even if they wanted to, and so if there is going to be someone to blame, sure, blame the one who has the most training, the most authority, the older one, the big one, etc. But really, let's be honest and say that, if we're committed to psychological trauma, emotional illiteracy, by refusing to teach these things in any scientific way systemically, and turning a blind eye, and then punishing people who come out, then we are going to get this situation. And it's a very isolating one. The isolation is actually one of the biggest wounds that an abuse survivor has to deal with. Because if you are hiding one of the most significant events in your life, significant in that the strongest feelings were involved, positive and negative, and believe me, it's absolutely terrifying and stuff. So, the strongest feelings are involved, and it has had profound impact. Your life is very different. Sexual abuse survivors sometimes don't have sex with their husbands. These have lifetime, impacts. Now, if the biggest shapers of your life are a shameful secret, you cannot feel that you are lovable, because we define ourselves by the biggest impacts of our life. We define ourselves by our peak emotional states, positive and negative. The part of me that was so terrified I would do anything to avoid that terror. The part of me that was so hurt I can't even deal with it. The part of me that was so in love I would do anything for that person. These peak states are where our identity rests. And if that's hidden, then what we're saying is the core of who I am is so unlovable, is so threatening, etc. Our cult is so dysfunctional that I cannot be loved as I am in this cult. And so this creates isolation, because a persona has to be developed on the other side that masks who we actually identify with, and simultaneously protects the cult's willful ignorance from being disrupted with truths that we don't want to deal with. So what does an individual abused by the Catholic Church with billions of dollars there, how do they get out of this situation? And I've watched all the sexual abuse type things that I could find for clues, because nobody taught me how to deal with this situation, which is a further pressure. When you find yourself, here I am, and nobody's taught me how to deal with this, and nobody wants to talk about it, and no one wants to get involved, because we're a cult of fear when it comes to handling and responding, to sexual, psychological abuse. So I wanted to see, what could an individual do? What could an individual do to respond to this? And so this project is an answer, and it's one variation, meaning, as a crude first iteration, it's bound to be wrong, but it's also bound to get certain things right, and people can learn from my mistakes and my successes. So that's, a very key goal in all this. The second is to be conscious enough to shift the pattern. Meaning, when Ann Watts said, I think what's kind of happening here with high is, we've reenacted your childhood abuse dynamic, and hopefully it isn't as bad as, when it was as a child. I obviously didn't get it. And the question is why? Well, a big reason is my parents were hippie parents. They took us to Findhorn. They sent us to Waldorf school. We ate organic vegetarian food. We lived in a passive solar home before it was cool. And so on the outside, we were the perfect hippie parents. The trouble is, in a chauvinistic cult, you learn about the outside. You don't learn about the inside. That's what chauvinism is. It values the masculine more than the feminine in men and women. And in the polarity between the inner world and the outer world, the outer is masculine, the inner world is feminine. So we had these hippie parents on the outside. My father ran a nonprofit. He was a director of Gaia Corp, an offshore currency hedge fund. We traveled around. So the outside was great. So I wanted to know why I wanted to die for the first time starting at 14. why my parents' traumatic, divorce, etc., has scarred all 5 of my siblings, into deep states of trauma and stuff. How does this schizophrenia fit together? Because in a chauvinistic cult, everyone told me I was lucky. Nobody told me that I'm living in horror, which was my inner reality. Nightmares, bedwetting, developing, Asperger's type, context, socially isolated, shutting down emotionally, learning disabilities, going numb, losing my emotional affect around age 12 under intense, repeated psychological humiliation by my father. But of course, our cult didn't want to look at that, nor did my parents. They wanted to say, see how lucky you are? You went to Waldorf school. Where my kindergarten teacher sent me down in the cellar and told me I'd be eaten by witches, which in a media-deprived environment, another Waldorf, phenomena, you believe. You've got witches and trolls at home. You've got, these sociopathic people that do these things at night at home. Now your kindergarten teacher sends you down in the dark because you're acting out the traumas at home in kindergarten. And she doesn't say, gee, you're awfully traumatized. What's going on at home? It's let's send the 5-year-old down into the cellar and activate his deepest fears until he calms down. A little bit bizarre, but but none of this stuff gets looked at. The Waldorf teacher that hits you physically, doesn't get looked at because you're in Waldorf school, the New Age and all that. So in this schizophrenic dynamic, all the words, all the symbols were there, but the substance wasn't. My parents had severe trauma. They were both severely abused children. And reading Rudolf Steiner didn't clear it up for them. Having a metaphysical bookstore didn't solve the issues. And I carried all the shame of that with none of the right to do so, because wasn't I lucky? So I didn't get the message in a denial pattern, etc. I just heard constantly how lucky I was to be abused by these people at Waldorf schools rather than abused in public school or whatever. So it makes it actually harder to see. And so it did all reenact with my therapist and with the teachers, the room of love, the word committed to a world where everyone wins, as they enact a protocol in which no one wins. No one wins with this protocol. It would have been so easy to go another way. No one wins. But you've got the words. We're committed to everyone winning, except we're not. We're committed to everyone losing, which is what you get with secrecy, denial, shame contracts, and all that. And they spelled it out. So that was their gift to me. I was a 5-year-old when this all abuse went down the first time. It was after $100,000 in therapy that this went down again. And I had read books about shame and stuff, so I could see, Jason Weston has just given me a shame contract to sign, promising never to tell anyone what happened, take all the impact from my abuser. So I didn't get it the first time because, abusers don't like to take the hit, and so they try and rephrase it all as love. I didn't get it the first time. I want to get it this time and not repeat it, which means I've got to go into this shit rather than just pretend it's not happening and let it go on all over again. I didn't get it when Peter abused me the first time. When I walked into his therapy room and saw his bulging sweatpants, I'm sitting a few feet apart with a man I've only met in workshops. It's one of the first times I've had a male therapist or anything like this. He's got a bulging sweatpant, and I'm like, Peter, is that an erection? Yes. Why? Well, I'm sexually attracted to you. I didn't get that I should have left that room at this point. But instead, what's going on? How do I learn what love is in high style? Well, it's learning about how Peter wants his open marriage and blah, 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 and paying for it. I didn't get it. And so it happened again at a much higher amplitude. So we need to get these things. I need to get these things. I don't want to repeat them again. So that's, a personal goal. And finally, to share bounty. In many ways, this is a hero's journey into the abyss, facing the dragon, into deep trauma, into the terrifying states of the psyche, into the terrifying unknown. And I found insight, truths, value, learning what works. I got married in the middle of this. After 100 lover relationships, none of which ended in marriage, all of which I made various mistakes in. I learned from the mistakes of the facilitators. Basically, I learned, much like I did with my parents, that if I did the opposite of what the facilitators did to me in similar terrain, my success would go way up. And it did. In the midst of trauma and PTSD, I not only helped another person with her trauma, but I helped myself by helping her, and I got married. And there's a bounty in every successful reintegration, in every post-traumatic growth cycle, in every return of the hero's journey. There are gifts for the community. Now, this is all, very bungled in our cult. In more successful tribal context, this whole thing was participated with consciously. The tribal leaders understood that the initiation into truth, the initiation often through a ritualized trauma, was the beginning of the transcendent movement into adulthood, and it led to the bearing of gifts that would keep the community alive. And so this was an honored process. Now, in the shame secrecy cult, once we traumatize someone, we go into fear, shame, and denial, and then pretend they don't exist and try and shut down communications. And, Edward Snowden becomes the most wanted man in the world, according to the U.S. intelligence agencies, because he's got their secrets. And, we got to shut him down, shut him down, shut him down. He's the truth is the threat, in other words. In healthier culture, there's an opening. What have you learned in your journey into the unknown? And how does that renew our community? And so that's the third goal, to share the bounty of what I've learned so that our culture can be richer. So that to whatever extent high survives in whatever form, that the community can share in some of this bounty. And so that's my third personal goal around this project.